Welcome back to the Barbell Medicine Podcast, where we bring modern medicine to strength and conditioning to modern medicine. I'm your host, Dr. Jordan Feigenbaum, and on this podcast, it's our May 2025 research review covering 3 brand new papers. One on how making your coffee can affect your cholesterol levels in a big way. The second is the large data set shows no association between testosterone levels and muscular strength. How is this possible? And the third and final paper, we're going to settle the score about eggs and cholesterol once and for all with the help of a new research paper. All that and more on this episode of the Barbell Medicine Podcast. And I am joined by the second most handsome doctor in North America, Dr. Austin Baraki. What's going on, man?
Hey, doing well. Wrapping up a couple weeks of work in the hospital. And interestingly, this morning I was leaving a patient room. I just finished doing a bedside procedure on this patient with my 2 interns, teaching them how to do a paracentesis. And on the way out, I got stopped by a gentleman who I'm going to shout out on the podcast today. I believe his name is David. He told me he's a dietetics intern. He's a big fan, followed our stuff for years. He said on his drive into the hospital this morning, he was listening to our last episode on labs. He only got partway through it, asked me not to spoil it from him. But yeah, it was pretty cool to run into somebody in the hospital who follows our stuff. So shout out to David.
Did you immediately recommend like better listening stuff for him? Like some other options? Like, hey, man, there's a big wide world of podcasts out there. Let me make a recommendation.
We need something that'll keep you awake on the road, not send you in the other direction.
That's right. Yeah. I wonder how many motor vehicle accidents we're actually responsible for. You didn't ask, but I'm going to tell you anyway. And you might wonder, like, why do I have such youthful exuberance right now? Why do I look like I'm so happy? Well, the answer, because again, you didn't ask even when prompted, is that I've returned to the gym. Finally, I'm back, baby. I'm back.
So post-op recovery and hamstring injury or adductor injury recovery.
Yeah. I mean, obviously taking almost 2 whole weeks off of like not lifting anything. And things were dark. It was trying times. I pretty much atrophied to a skeleton. I think I actually got diagnosed with sarcopenia. I did a self-diagnosis.
Acute sarcopenia, sure.
Acute onset sarcopenia. Yeah, but now fully resolved. Two training sessions and I'm back. So surprisingly, or maybe I shouldn't be surprised at my own resiliency or whatever, but like I'm fine.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was doing the pendulum squat because that's just what I was doing before this little, and I was like, okay, I have like no pain and I'm pretty strong. Like the time before I did like 245 for sets of 10, like tempo.
Mm-hmm.
And that was like RP air with no discomfort. And I'm like, should I like get under a bar?
Yeah, this might be one of Derek's favorite situations where you feel ready before you are ready.
Yeah. So I was like, well, I'll do some tempo squats and I'll cap it at 315. I can't go above that, whatever. And everything was fine.
Good.
And then, so we'll see. On my way to my next injury. No, I'm just kidding. It should be fine. A few announcements before we get into this month's research review. Again, we did just release a new template. It's our 2nd generation General Strength and Conditioning 1. It includes 5 separate templates. One, it's got our in-season sort of template. So if you are an athlete in a non-barbell sport, right? So not a power lifter, not an Olympic weightlifter, but you do BJJ, you play volleyball, you play soccer, and you're like, well, look, how do I organize my resistance training, my conditioning around my sport during season? Well, we give you a template for that. We also give off-season templates in both the 3 and 4 day frequency varieties. We updated the conditioning, the programming for the resistance trainings, all this sort of stuff to try to manage the total training load so you get the best results for your time. We also have a few new items and services on our website. So one is the program library. If you're like, look, I love your programs, but there's so many of them, and I want to be able to like choose between, and you're all of them at my own on my own whim. Well, here you go. We got a program library. It's $12.99 a month. You get full access to all of our programs. It's all serviced through the app. So if you're an Android user or an iPhone user, you can get that. Link that in the description below. We also have new articles on the website, at least 3 of them. One is how to train while losing weight, what to do if you have lateral or outside pain in your elbow for lifters, and shoulder pain guide. So we've got those 3 articles up on the website. We also released our testosterone course. It's our first educational course, and this one's on testosterone with Dr. Austin Baraki as your instructor. He's pretty good. He's okay.
I like to think so.
Yeah. Yeah, he's okay. And then also, if you've ever wanted one of the Barbell Medicine coaches to check your form on a particular exercise, you now can do that for free. So go to our website, click the shop tab, and then form check, and we'll take care of the rest. We'll get you hooked up with the Barbell Medicine coach and get you on your way. Any other announcements you want to make before we go into this?
No, I think you covered it all. That's good.
All right, cool. So let's get into our first paper. This is on coffee. All right, so the title of the paper is Cafestol and K-Wall Concentrations in Workplace Machine Coffee Compared with Conventional Brewing Methods. This is by a research group out of Sweden. It was published February 2025 in the journal Nutrition, Metabolism, and Cardiovascular Diseases. So just as a background, in the United States, about 3/4 of the population, adult population, reports drinking coffee. Half of them drink coffee daily, and that certainly includes both of us. I personally go for an espresso and a pour over. So paper filtered coffee the first thing in the morning. I'll usually have I guess that's technically a third cup later on because the espresso certainly counts. That's my daily coffee consumption. What's your go-to coffee setup?
Yeah, I usually have anywhere from, I would say, 1 to 4 a day. And I have a espresso machine at home, kind of nerd out on that, as well as either doing pour over or an AeroPress. And then when I'm in the hospital, I tend to discriminate way less. When I need it to get through the work or to a little early afternoon pick me up on busy days. But yeah, that's my preference.
Biohackers hate them. Just so much coffee. So as far as health goes, drinking coffee has predominantly been associated with benefit. So for example, for heart disease, there are large data sets generally showing that regular coffee intake seems to reduce the risk of dying from some sort of cardiovascular disease. It's like a J-shaped curve. Typically within that 1 to 4 cups per day range. Also likely some benefit from fatty liver disease. Again, that's a pretty common recommendation there. Colon cancer and perhaps some forms of dementia. And none of this is related to like caffeine. People are like, oh, I just take caffeine. It's probably due to like the polyphenol content. And polyphenols, don't let your eyes glaze over. This is just a fancy chemical term for like stuff from plants that we think is beneficial probably. And they should just call it that, like beneficial plant stuff.
Yeah. There are just countless of these compounds from plant-derived foods that confer a lot of health benefits, both known and likely yet to be discovered. And especially for people who don't tend to consume a lot of plants and vegetables and fruits in their diet, there are probably a decent chunk of the population for whom coffee consumption might be their greatest source of polyphenols in their daily diet. That's not to say that that's advisable. Like it's fine to consume coffee, obviously, but we would prefer it to be alongside lots of other, polyphenol rich foods, fruits, vegetables, berries, olive oil, all sorts of things like that. But yeah, very common source for many people.
Yeah, and there are no biological free lunches when it comes to food, and people will just ask, hey, well, what are the risks of like drinking coffee? And as far as risks go, many will suggest that caffeine from coffee is harmful. They do so incorrectly. That hasn't really shown up in any of the data sets looking at various health conditions. And additionally, it's very difficult to overdose on caffeine via any liquid, including coffee, as water intoxication typically occurs before caffeine toxicity. Most caffeine overdoses, whether they're accidental or intentional, are due to powders and pills.
Mm-hmm.
For example, we did that on one of our mystery cases.
Yeah.
However, that doesn't mean that coffee is necessarily without risk. And one risk has to do with how coffee affects cholesterol, which is related to how the coffee is prepared.
Mm-hmm.
So coffee intake from unfiltered coffee has been known to increase low density lipoprotein LDL cholesterol as long ago as the 80s. And this is thought to be due to the diterpenes, cafestol, and K-wall. Diterpenes, just a fancy chemical nerd term. Interestingly, I don't know if you knew this, but the way that diterpenes are made by either like marine animals, plants, or whatever is through the HMG-CoA reductase pathway, which is the way that we make cholesterol in the body. Now, diterpenes and cholesterols that's not the same chemical structure, but when I saw that, I go, oh.
Yeah, that's interesting. Didn't know that.
I wonder how researchers found out that these diterpenes were like mechanistically related to increasing LDL cholesterol. Like, did some botanist or like other biologists say, well, yeah, they make these diterpenes via the HMG-CoA reductase pathway, and some clinician was like, makes total sense. Let's look at LDL.
Yeah, it's wizardry. I mean, we often end up in these conversations where we learn something and we're like, how did anyone think to think of this at all, much less actually go through the process of figuring it out. It is pretty remarkable.
Yeah. And there's even been some research groups who have tried to figure out, well, like, is there a dose-dependent relationship between the intake of these diterpenes and like LDL cholesterol? And in fact, yes, there has been a few studies on that, and it's suggested that for every 2 milligrams of these diterpene intake, that increases blood cholesterol levels by about 1 milligram per deciliter. And we know that there's a dose-dependent relationship between LDL cholesterol reduction and heart disease risk. We've talked about that ad nauseum on this podcast. I suspect we'll have to keep talking about it because social media being what it is. Mm-hmm. So there's also been some evidence to suggest that habitual unfiltered coffee intake increases heart disease risk by increasing LDLs through this mechanism that has been suggested, so much so that the Nordic nutrition recommendations from 2023 recommend filtered coffee in place of unfiltered coffee. So while the concentrations of the diterpenes like cafestol and K-wall are high in unfiltered coffee and moderate in espresso and like French press coffees, little is known about the diterpene content in machine brewed coffee, like you may have when you're not being discriminate about where you get your coffee from in the hospital.
Yeah.
So this study set out to investigate. They analyzed real-world coffee samples from 14 machines located in 4 different healthcare facilities. Again, this study was basically made for you.
Yeah.
For comparison, the researchers prepared additional common coffee preparations. So they did a drip coffee. They used a paper filter, a percolator, which is no filter, French press, which uses a metal filter, and boiled coffee, which is also no filter. They also tried to see what the diterpene content was like for boiled coffee that was filtered through a sock.
Lovely. Hopefully clean.
Hopefully clean. I was just thinking that. I'm like, just imagine if you were like a cardiologist and you were at an Airbnb and all they had was like a way to make boiled coffee. And like, so of course you need your coffee. You're like, no, I can't have these diterpenes, and you pull out a sock. Like, how do you?
There is a product out there called a coffee sock that people use to make cold brew, I believe. We have no financial relationship with them or affiliation, but I'm aware that is a thing.
There you go. So they analyzed these samples in the lab for diterpene concentration, and then they did some fancy statistical modeling where they looked at, well, hey, if somebody was drinking 3 cups per day, 5 days per week of unfiltered coffee or this machine brewed coffee, like, would there be any benefit from them to replacing this coffee intake with like paper filtered coffee? And, how would that shake out for heart disease risk? So what did they find? Well, the coffee preparation type that had the lowest diterpene concentration was paper filtered drip coffee. So using normal paper filters, because apparently there's these other type of filters that I've never seen. And I consider myself like a coffee like enthusiast. Mm-hmm. Have you ever heard of like an aroma filter?
Mm-mm.
Yeah, I don't know what those are either. I assume it's just a more porous type of filter. But in any case, this paper filtered drip coffee had about 6.1 milligrams per liter of cafestol and 4.5 milligrams per liter of K-wall on average. That was the lowest for any of the brewing methods. Now, as far as the highest goes, well, espresso, it had about 1,000 milligrams per liter of cafestol and over 600 milligrams per liter of K-wall. The boiled coffee was similar to the espresso, about the same level, but when you put it through a sock, it dropped down to about in the 20s, which is pretty low. The brewing machines, which is basically hot water plus coffee beans that are ground up and a metal filter, had a cafestol level of 175 milligrams per liter and a K-wall concentration of 141 milligrams per liter. So somewhere in the middle, not the highest, not the lowest, but somewhere in the middle. So the estimated effect of replacing 3 cups of brewing machine coffee with paper filtered coffee 5 days per week was estimated to reduce LDL cholesterol by a small amount, about 0.58 millimoles per liter, which if you extrapolate that out over 5 years, they modeled this to represent a 13% risk reduction in heart disease in 5 years and a 36% risk reduction over 40 years. So before I go further to like kind of interpretation takeaways, is that going to change your behavior in the hospital at all?
Yeah, so just for context, because you used international units, 0.58 millimoles for folks who are more used to, American units, that's about 23 milligrams per deciliter, which is it's not nothing. It's a notable decrease, and particularly if that is sustained over the lifespan, there will be some detectable, difference in risk over a long enough time span. So that's probably what translates as far as those modeled effects. And so these are data that I was generally familiar with. I mean, I think the extreme example of like espresso and definitely the boiled coffee, that's like traditional Middle Eastern or like Turkish coffee where they just boil it straight and then you pour it right into your mug with no filtering.
Yeah.
That all that is likely to have the highest amounts. And even when it comes to espresso, recognizing that is, coffee being brewed under high pressure through a metal portafilter without, paper filtering, which tends to limit the amount of these diterpenes and certain other oils as they get into your coffee. So if I were at ultra high cardiovascular risk, then this is something that I would want to be pulling all the levers that I could to try to minimize this risk as much as possible. In my situation as it is right now, this kind of ties into some of our discussion last time from the lab standpoint. I'm at, I would deem quite low cardiovascular risk from the standpoint of essentially all risk factors, except the blood lipids that are not as low as they could possibly be. They're in a generally fine place for primary prevention kind of targets. Would I prefer they be lower? Of course, we view that favorably. And so, we discussed last time, for example, the changes that were observed over like my last two lipid checks, and they were technically within that range of like, biological variation, analytical variation. To the extent that it represented a true increase, I would likely attribute it to mostly actually to an increase in the espresso consumption compared with what I was consuming traditionally before that. And so that's something that it is actually possible when you are brewing espresso on a regular machine like what I have. They make, little paper filters that you can put into the bottom of your portafilter. And that's something that would be straightforward. And it actually doesn't tend to impact the flavor profile, for example, of what comes out on the other end, because that is like my strong preference. If you said I couldn't have it at all anymore, I'd say, no, I'm going to do it. And then I'll just do what I need to do otherwise to manage my heart disease risk. But I think in general, shifting things towards coffee that is filtered through paper in some fashion, whether using a pour over through paper, AeroPress through paper filters, espresso machine through paper filters, would be a wiser decision. Now, if somebody's at super low cardiovascular risk, I don't think this is going to be like life changing in general. But again, as we talked about last time, the minimizers are the maximizers. If somebody wanted to pull all the levers they could to maximize their health span, their longevity, minimize their risk of having any adverse event ever, then that's a pretty straightforward, simple thing to do. And it's probably something that, I can more routinely put a paper filter in the bottom of my espresso portafilter before I pull a shot.
Yeah, I'm in agreement. Like those who have, certainly moderate to high risk for heart disease based on their lipid profile, who are pulling other levers. So maybe they're on a statin, maybe they're on a ezetimibe, maybe they're even on a PCSK9 inhibitor as well. Plus they're doing lifestyle stuff, whatever else. Yeah, this seems like worthy of a question, right? Particularly if you suspect that culturally maybe they're super into like the boiled coffee, for example. The other thing is that I don't know, and maybe this is me projecting, so people can call me out on this, but I get the sense amongst many, particularly in the health fitness space, that there's this view that like espresso is better type of coffee, or like a French press is a better type of coffee, or an Americano is an elevated experience compared to like a drip, or like, a regular full, the stuff you make, with the typical drip type thing. And I don't know if that's true, if I'm just like, or maybe it's just like a fancy type thing, like a preference. You could make the case that a drip coffee with a paper filter is maybe a little more health promoting than habitually just defaulting to an Americano or an espresso. And depending on the level of intake, that would be, or even a Turkish coffee. Ooh, I want a Turkish coffee. It's like, you sure? Are you sure? It may be also even worth like investigating the actual machine in the hospital that you habitually get your coffee from, or the workplace otherwise, right? If it is one of those machines that uses a paper filter, I have,
wouldn't sweat it. Yeah.
Check the box. But if it's like, no filter. The most interesting thing in this paper, if you end up reading the whole thing, they actually did a test with a clean French press versus a dirty French press. And the dirty French press actually had less diterpene content.
Oh, interesting.
Because effectively it worked as like an additional level of filtering than the metal filter they use in a French press. Yeah. So maybe don't clean your French press. I think that's the take.
Yeah, French press definitely not my favorite. If I could, I would just drink all espresso all the time.
Same.
But I think that, popping a little paper filter in the bottom of the portafilter is an easy enough thing to do to potentially mitigate that.
Yeah, people with Chemexes that have a metal filter punch in the air right now. They're just like,
I mean, that might be well intentioned if they're worried from a environmental standpoint or sustainability standpoint or something like that. It's all trade offs, I suppose.
Yep, no biological free lunches. That's should make a T-shirt. Support for today's episode comes from Square, your all-in-one business partner making your day-to-day easier. The coffee shop I go to every morning uses Square. It's super easy, it's seamless, and I can just tap and go using Apple Pay and Square's technology. Plus, the staff can focus more on making great coffee rather than taking my payment. Now, whether you're running a coffee shop, a gym, or something that's entirely your own, Square gives you the flexibility to grow at your own pace, and even set up an online store in just a few clicks. From point-of-sale systems and payments to inventory and customer tools, Square brings everything together in one simple platform. And right now, listeners can get up to $200 off Square hardware when you sign up at square.com/go/barbell. That's SQUARE.com/go/barbell. Visit Square to get started because the right tools make all the difference. All right, second study here on the May 2025 research review. This is titled Testosterone Levels Positively Linked to Muscle Mass, but Not Strength in Adult Males Aged 20 to 59 Years, a Cross-Sectional Study. Now, if I sent you this paper and you just read the title, you'd be like, this is bullshit. I assume that you would read and be like, there's something wrong with the way they tested strength, how they define strength, or whatever. Something's wrong. Is that fair to say?
I mean, reading the title, my first question is, what was the strength test and how did they go about that? Knowing what we know and how much we've talked about this in the past, I think it's less shocking than it may be to somebody who's listening, who might immediately recoil with skepticism. Yeah. But strength testing is a topic that we kind of hammer on a lot when it comes to research on the topic.
Yeah. Okay, so just a quick review. Testosterone is a sex steroid produced in the testes of men and ovaries in women predominantly, although a smaller amount is produced by the adrenal gland. That's a little fatty tissue gland that sits on top of your kidneys. Total testosterone levels are normally somewhere between 300 on the low level to 800 to 1,000 on the top end. Again, it's variable by lab, and that's nanograms per deciliter. There is significant analytical variance, so just due to the methods and the equipment used to test testosterone. And also there's significant biological variance just due to day-to-day variation. We've hammered that in the past, so no need to go further. Now, as far as the connection between testosterone and muscle mass, we think, based on available evidence, that there is a significant correlation or association between testosterone levels and muscle mass. That is, the higher someone's testosterone levels, the higher or greater amount of muscle mass we predict them to have in a cross-sectional study. So you just look at people in a population, in a group, at a given point in time. It's also associated with lower levels of body fat. And again, this is just a snapshot in time. Longitudinally, so if you follow people, particularly if they're exercising and changing their dietary patterns or whatever, it gets messier. But at any given time, all else being equal, you would suggest that higher testosterone levels within the normal range tend to correlate with more muscle mass and less body fat. That's not really controversial. And that's in men specifically. In women, most of the data really shows no correlation. It's just messier. And the testosterone levels are about 1/20th of men. So not really a lot doing there. As far as the connection between muscle mass and strength, so we're not really talking about testosterone for a brief second. Again, in a cross-section, so just snapshot in time, pretty strong association. If you didn't know anything else about a whole group of people and you were like, well, who's the strongest? You would probably want to pick the person with the most amount of muscle mass, just because outside of skill acquisition, certain neuromuscular things that you can't really tell from the jump, people with more muscle mass tend to be able to create more force. And so you would predict they would be the strongest. Longitudinally, so over time, this is more complicated. So typically when people are involved in a strength training program or resistance training program at large, they gain both muscle mass and muscle strength. There's a high degree of overlap between these specific methods to prioritize muscle size, hypertrophy, and muscular strength. And so you have to go through some pretty interesting efforts to eliminate one of the responses. So for example, if you try to set up a study where people gained only muscle mass but not strength, it would look like maybe blood flow restriction training. And you're like, okay, well, you had to really bend over backwards to do that. And if you wanted to gain strength but not muscle mass, it would look like 1 rep maxes every single day. And you're like, okay, so there's just not enough volume to drive muscle mass. But outside of that, most normal, quote unquote, normal or traditional strength training programs will produce both. Okay. But it just gets messier the further out and further out you go, because people will gain all sorts of, different amounts of muscle mass and not as much strength. And that just comes down to other factors that contribute to strength performance, like neuromuscular adaptations and and different genetics and such. So just creating more muscle mass doesn't necessarily make somebody stronger if that muscle is uncoordinated for the test, right? So just doing a bunch of leg extensions, yep, likely to make your quads bigger, for example. But if you're testing strength on a squat, it might not be so great. We've talked about this again and ad nauseum. So that's just muscle mass and strength. Now, if we go further to testosterone and strength, what is the connection there? Again, in untrained men, there's a moderate to strong positive relationship between testosterone concentrations and muscle strength. It does not appear to predict strength gain unless people are using high doses, super physiological doses of testosterone. This is why we say, it doesn't really matter what your testosterone levels are as far as your response to strength training, unless you're hypogonadal, so low, or super physiological, you're taking a bunch of extra testosterone. And in women, it's not associated with strength in premenopausal women. So with all of that preamble out of the way, the goal of this study was to explore the relationship between total testosterone levels, muscle mass, and strength in young to middle-aged adults. So they used data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, so NHANES data. This is a voluntary US-based survey that's administered every 2 years to assess the health of individuals in the community through interviews, physical examinations, and diagnostic evaluations. So their sample size was just under 4,500 adults. Average age was 39, and just over half were men, so women were involved in this study as well. The variables at play here, first was total testosterone. So they grouped these different relationships that we're going to discuss between testosterone and strength and testosterone and muscle mass based on 4 different quartiles of testosterone. So quartile 1, these people had the lowest testosterone level. So it was less than 300 nanograms per deciliter, which is consistent with the lab findings of someone who is hypogonadal, although that in and of itself does not necessarily diagnose somebody with hypogonadism. The second quartile, so the second lowest level of testosterone, was between 300 and 400 nanograms per deciliter. And the third quartile was 400 to 518 nanograms per deciliter. And the highest quartile, quartile 4, they had testosterone levels of greater than 518 nanograms per deciliter. They used a DEXA to assess muscle mass, so pretty good. And then for strength, they used a hand grip strength. And they had various cutoffs for what was low strength, low muscle strength. As far as the results go, people with the higher testosterone levels, that tended to be associated with those being individuals who were younger, those who were living alone, those who consumed alcohol, those who had a lower BMI, those with a lower income, those with a higher protein intake, and higher activity level. Some of those are surprising. The biohackers punch in the air. They're like, wait. Lower income and alcohol intake. I don't like either of those things. And then as far as the connection to various disease states, those with a higher testosterone level also had a lower prevalence of high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, liver disease, arthritis, and sarcopenia. All of this corroborates stuff we've talked about before with respect to testosterone level, that it's more reflective of your current health status. So the healthier you are, leaner you are, up to a certain point, more active you are. Generally speaking, your testosterone level is going to be lower than somebody who's insufficiently active, carrying more body fat, and or has more medical conditions. In men, there was a consistent positive association between testosterone levels and muscle mass, meaning that people in the fourth quartile tended to have more muscle mass than people in the third quartile, who tended to have more muscle mass than people in the second quartile, and so on and so forth. However, there was no association between testosterone levels and muscle mass in women, which in the preamble, I kind of mentioned that was the case, so we found that again. Hooray! More corroboration. The interesting part of the study was that there was no association between testosterone and strength in either gender. And again, strength was tested by hand grip strength. So they grabbed the hand grip dynamometer, got a value, and they moved on. So before I get into my interpretation, how does that strike you? Hey, man, no connection between testosterone levels and strength. How do you explain that?
Yeah. I think that it bears repeating the disconnect between muscle mass and strength in untrained people or on untrained tasks. I think, it remains an open question of among those with higher amounts of muscle mass, if they train the task, is their strength ceiling or their potential strength performance greater compared with those with less muscle mass, even if those with less muscle mass also, train the same task. The relationship between kind of basal testosterone levels and lean body mass is something that, as you mentioned, we've talked about a ton and is completely unsurprising. The relationship between medical conditions, also very unsurprising. Those who have more medical conditions, they're going to tend to not only have lower testosterone levels, but also likely for other reasons have less muscle mass, have less lean body mass. They're going to tend to be less active, less, exercisers, things like that in general. The aspect with women here, not only as you said, do things get a little messier, a little murkier there, but the levels are so low, the absolute levels are so low that actually the tests that we use to measure testosterone levels can get a little fuzzy at those very, very low levels as well. And so, I think it also bears repeating how much of that analytical variation, biological variation, the test-to-test accuracy and reliability and things like that, those effects are already pretty significant, even when measuring testosterone levels in men. And when you're measuring minuscule absolute amounts of testosterone in women, those error bars dwarf the actual amounts that you're measuring. And so things can get a lot messier at those lower levels as well.
Yeah. So my explanation here is someone is like, okay, testosterone, muscle mass, that connection makes sense, particularly in men. But what this no connection to strength? I don't buy that. All right. Well, fine. I'll explain it away for you. And you can sleep well tonight with this explanation. Hand grip strength is not a good test for strength. I'll say it again. Hand grip strength is not a good test for strength. And in fact, all the uproar that people have about BMI? You know what? Take all that energy and ignore BMI and channel it to hand grip strength. Because as bad as you think BMI might be for screening for obesity or whatever, hand grip strength is far worse for screening for strength adequacy. So hand grip strength primarily measures force production of the intrinsic hand muscles, which tend to not correlate well with strength in dynamic tasks. So, we're talking about is something for like a 1 rep max squat to your ability to pick up your groceries or a grandchild or whatever. It's just because the intrinsic muscles of the hand just don't really hypertrophy that much unless they were previously atrophied. You had a condition or you were mobilized. And further, they just don't change that much even when you get real strong, unless you're like one of those. And I hate to, and you're not a weirdo if you're a grip strength person. If you're into bending nails, ripping phone books, whatever, Captain's a Crush, that doesn't mean you're a weirdo. It just means like you're actively training grip strength. And I would expect you to crush a hand grip dynamometer test. But other people, like your competitive weightlifter, I don't know that your hand grip strength is going to change that much. And in fact, one study showed that hand grip strength in male lifters wasn't significantly different than non-lifters. And this was predominantly true in the dominant hand, although there was less of an asymmetry in the non-dominant hand. So you could make a case that if you were going to assess hand grip strength, and that was going to be your strength proxy for assessing, do they have adequate strength? Well, let's look at their non-dominant hand, because there's going to be a bigger difference there potentially. So in fact, my opinion on the hand grip strength, as far as it being a marker of when can it be useful? It's only useful until it's too late. When somebody shows a frank deficit in hand grip strength, I'm like, this person's probably already sarcopenic. And at that point, it's kind of too late, because whatever metabolic, endocrine, or other medical conditions that got them to sarcopenia, or a lifestyle, whatever, we could have addressed that earlier. And now we're fighting an uphill battle. It's a Sisyphean task, probably. Unfortunately, sarcopenia is tough. And oh, by the way, individuals with sarcopenia, strength loss is much greater than muscle loss initially. And it's not until they've lost so much muscle, you're like, oh shit, this person actually might have sarcopenia. And the definition, by the way, is not just muscle loss. People say, oh, sarcopenia is muscle loss. No, it's not. It is it's basically loss of muscle function that is associated with a significant loss of muscle, and you got to have both to get the diagnosis. So, that's just to clarify. So, all of this is to say that the hand grip strength, to my mind, is not an adequate sort of assessment of somebody's strength. And I wouldn't really predict in a population that there's going to be a huge difference related to testosterone. But this can go even further, and I'll get your take on this because you are the instructor of the Barbell Medicine Testosterone course. What is the specificity of low muscle strength and low amounts of muscle mass for hypogonadism? How specific are those two sort of findings? We would have to define them and validate them. I get all that, but just generally speaking, I'm not that strong. I don't have a lot of muscle. Do I have hypogonadism? How specific is that?
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting question. So the idea here would be that if you are seeing someone and you can identify that they do have low muscle mass and muscle strength, would you expect them to also have low testosterone levels? And I would say that relationship is probably somewhere in the range of low to moderate. I'm trying to actively control my own selection bias in my mind right now, because I think of the folks who I see in the hospitalized setting, many of whom have low muscle mass, low muscle strength, who are unable to get up independently and take care of themselves. And if I did check their testosterone levels, especially during their hospitalization, they would, by and large, I think most of them would actually be low. And so there is a significant segment for whom that is the case. However, among the more general and what we'll call ambulatory population, just people out there living their life, I think that relationship is going to be poorer. But at the same time, if they're ambulatory, if they're able to get around, move around, function in their day-to-day life, they also are not meeting diagnostic criteria for sarcopenia. So I think that the relationship between sarcopenia and low testosterone or hypogonadism is probably somewhere in the range of low to moderate, I would say. I'd be interested to see what data we have on that topic. Yeah, that's my just off the dome take. It'd be interesting to dig into some data on that.
Yeah, I would, with acquired hypogonadism, in like adult onset, I would suspect there'd be a reduction in strength performance. Although how much and by what metric, that's going to get messy, right? Are we testing people's squat, or leg press 1 rep max, or like, leg extension or whatever? And do we have previous data when they were eugonadal? That's tough, right? Hand grip strength ain't going to get it done. And then muscle mass, it's like, well, how much muscle mass were they carrying before? What was their, their muscle mass index, for example, skeletal muscle mass index, for example?
And one important point of clarification here is that what I'm not saying or suggesting, nor do I think you are, is that these folks are likely to have primary hypogonadism or testosterone deficiency as the cause of their sarcopenia.
Correct. Yeah.
Rather, it is more likely that both the testosterone deficiency and the sarcopenia are being caused by a kind of common underlying medical condition. It might be related to an underlying inflammatory disease or cancer or metabolic syndrome or things like that is causing both, rather than saying, oh, that person has low muscle mass, they probably just have testosterone deficiency, and that's all that I need to address. It's probably both are being caused by something else in the majority of situations.
Yep, 100% agree. So just briefly, I wanted to talk about strength and muscle mass. Like, it seems highly likely to me that the body, as a highly adaptable organism, and series of, redundant physiological processes that are ultimately designed to get you to thrive in your environment. It seems highly likely to me that the muscles and the neuromuscular system and musculoskeletal system will leverage any potential adaptive process to improve function. And within that, increasing muscle size and the functional unit of the muscle, it seems likely that it will leverage increased muscle cross-sectional area to produce more force. The problem is it's not a one-to-one relationship where you gain, X amount of muscle mass, you get Y amount of strength. It's just not the case. It just depends on how that muscle mass was accrued. If you did it only through leg extensions, I don't know about your transference to the squat or the deadlift, right? If that's how you're testing your strength. If you accrued all of this extra muscle mass predominantly by training the squat and the deadlift, I would assume that there's going to be a higher degree of correlation between muscle mass increase and strength performance. And in addition, by the way, people who gain muscle mass from resistance training, that indicates that they are responding to the training program. And so they are also likely to get stronger. And so when people say, a good indication of if you're gaining muscle mass is if you're getting stronger, it's like, yeah, I don't know how strong that correlation is, but it certainly, you would expect that if someone's responding well to an appropriately dosed, appropriately formulated resistance training program. I don't know what the R value is, but it's probably decent.
Yeah, it's kind of a circular claim.
Yeah. It's like, hey, look, if you're getting stronger and gaining muscle, you're probably getting bigger and getting stronger.
Yeah. You're responding to the program if you're responding to the program.
Yeah, exactly. I just think that the relationship between muscle size increase and increases in strength, it's far more variable amongst individuals. Some people are going to get a lot bigger and a little stronger. Some people are going to get a little bigger and a lot stronger. And other people, it's going to be somewhere in the middle. And that's all fine. I just would predict that any good program, and by good, I mean a program that works, you respond well to it, you're probably going to gain some amount of muscle mass and some amount of strength. And so there is going to be a positive association between muscle size increase and strength increase. It's just highly variable amongst individuals. And that's the best I can say.
I think even though we may be outliers, you and I, to some extent, are an example of this. I think that you have achieved a greater degree of hypertrophy than I have through our training.
Sure.
Yet we have ended up in more or less the same place with all of our PRs, or like within, I don't know, 10 or 15 pounds of one another on all three of the big lifts. So
Yeah.
That's just kind of an interesting observation.
Does that make me less impressive strength-wise, but more impressive physique-wise? And like, what do I have to feel bad about? Because that's what I'm going to focus on.
It's taken you more muscle to achieve the same strength, or I am, following in the footsteps of Tanner Seguir.
Yeah, the muscleless wonder. Yeah, great nickname. And then lastly, I'd like to say that testosterone levels, as long as they're within the normal range, I still don't think that they're very predictive of somebody's response to training, with the caveat that I would predict a generally healthier person to probably have a better response to training. And so they're likely to have a higher testosterone level at baseline. And so if if we're speaking in absolutes, which we try not to do, sure, you got a higher testosterone level, you're probably going to respond better to training, but it's not due to the testosterone directly. It's due to the other stuff that you don't have going on under the hood that's likely predictive. And this is, again, within normal limits. If you have super physiological levels of testosterone, well, you can do all sorts of things through testosterone, our Lord and Savior.
Yeah.
But, yeah. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, there's so many ways that people can kind of trick themselves here. I think that we've made a good point that obviously there is a relationship here, but it is a lot more complex and murkier than people tend to assume. And there might be people who are like, well, I did these lifestyle things and my testosterone got better and then my gains improved a ton. And it's like, yeah, like we said, if you get help, say like, oh, I improved my sleep, quality and hygiene and duration, and I'm sleeping way better. Yeah, that'll make your testosterone go up, and it'll improve your recovery, and it'll improve your performance, and it'll improve your, hypertrophy and your fat loss and all sorts of other things. But it's not necessarily one-to-one related to how many, nanograms per deciliter of total testosterone are circulating in your blood. It's all, part of a bigger picture of health and responsiveness to training.
Last thing I'll get your hot take on, again, since you're a testosterone course instructor, so we got to give you some hot takes here, opportunities and such. What's the effect of TRT in those without hypogonadism? So someone's just like, well, I'm 40 now. It's time for TRT. No testing, but they're not hypogonadal. They just get on TRT. What is that effect on their sort of, strength or resistance training trajectory? What would you predict there?
Yeah, I think that, you're taking somebody who is what we would call eugonadal, or has normal kind of levels of circulating testosterone and healthy function, and you are supplementing them beyond that. So whether or not the level that you ever measure fully exceeds that like upper limit of the normal range on the blood test, they're super physiological for them. A lot of folks, they may live at a particular level that's based on various factors. It's based not only on production of testosterone, but feedback between the testes and the brain. Has to do with things like their androgen receptor sensitivity and various polymorphisms and things like that. And so everybody is, when they're in that healthy eugonadal state, they will equilibrate to a slightly different level. So some people are perfectly healthy and eugonadal at 400, some at 500, some at 700. We looked at my labs last time. It was like 799 at the time it was checked within the error bars of the test. Other people 900, whatever. You just equilibrate where you equilibrate based on your biology, your genetics, your general health and things like that. And so whether or not it fully exceeds that upper limit of normal, if you have somebody who is not testosterone deficient, there's no indication of that, and you supplement them, yeah, they're super physiologic. So they're basically on the juice, so to speak.
Yeah, unless their like regular level was like 900, we'll just say. Like you measured it, 4 times. You really did your due diligence, 900. And then you put them on 100 milligrams of testosterone cypionate, per week. And now at their trough, they're 250 or something like that, and they're like, well, you just lowered my testosterone, but I'm taking testosterone. You're like, yeah, well, sucks to suck. Like, yeah, I don't know. I just can't really get behind the idea of like, we gotta do TRT for somebody who's not, frankly, hypogonadal or symptomatic or something that would otherwise improve their life. It's like, look, you just robbed Peter to pay Paul, and now you're on this agent that has some non-zero amount of side effects potential, and probably not worth it, generally speaking.
Yeah, I would just encourage avoidance of a overly myopic view of just the blood level itself. Yeah. That's part of a much more complex picture. And the aim of, a testosterone therapy can be super useful for a lot of people, but the aim is to actually improve health and not cause harm. And so it's actually not that hard to do that if you practice correctly, but a lot of people don't.
There you go. All right, last study that we're going to talk about here on the May 2025 research review with Dr. Austin Baraki and the Barbell Medicine Podcast. The title is called Impact of Dietary Cholesterol from Eggs and Saturated Fat on LDL Cholesterol Levels, a randomized crossover study. This is by Carter and a research group out of Australia. It was published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition in May of 2025. All right, so for a little background here, the diet heart hypothesis argues that reducing dietary saturated fat will reduce serum or blood cholesterol levels, thus slowing the buildup of fats, cholesterol, and other substances in the blood vessel walls that we call atherosclerosis. The lipid hypothesis takes this a step further and predicts that lowering blood cholesterol levels will reduce the incidence of heart disease. So dietary cholesterol, as far as its interface with all of this, generally speaking, has little to no effect on blood cholesterol levels directly outside of individuals who are, quote, hyper absorbers. So they take up a bunch of dietary cholesterol within the small intestine, or in individuals with various dietary patterns that sort of unlocks their ability to uptake a bunch of dietary cholesterol. And generally speaking, those folks will be consuming a diet that is high in saturated fat and low in polyunsaturated fats. So again, dietary patterns that are high in saturated fat and or added sugars, not only do they tend to consume a lot of dietary cholesterol on top of that, but they also tend to absorb more of that dietary cholesterol too. Now, recent dietary guidelines have gone back and forth on a specific upper limit to dietary cholesterol. It was previously 300 milligrams per day in the previous guidelines, and then a specific recommendation was removed in the 2020 to 2025 guidelines. And then the most recent 2025 to 2030 guidelines say that, well, hey, look, the National Academy of Sciences, they recommend to limit dietary cholesterol and take as much as possible. It's a one-sentence throwaway thing in the middle of this PDF. And I suspect that not only if lay people are reading this, but even clinicians who are not like lipidologists or have otherwise specialized nutrition training, they're like, I don't know, man. Just no dietary cholesterol. Okay, I guess we're going on with that. And for context, eggs have about 187 milligrams of cholesterol per egg. So like 2 eggs per day would put you over the previous limit of 300 milligrams per day. And any egg consumption would put you over the National Academy of Sciences recommendation, which seems...
Don't love that.
In a word, stupid.
Yeah.
All right. And, by the way, the saturated fat content in eggs, about 1.6 grams per egg, so pretty low. So when people say, well, no, it's not the dietary cholesterol of the egg, it's the saturated fat. I'm like, it's 1.6 grams? Yeah, man, that's like 9.5 calories, worth of saturated fat. That's nothing unless...
Depending on what you're cooking it in, too. Yeah.
Yes, or like 16 whole egg omelet. Like, well, that's different. The dose in there is a bit higher. So the goal of this study was to provide high-quality evidence on how a dietary pattern that has high dietary cholesterol levels but low saturated fat levels via eggs, let's see what that does to blood lipids. So 48 healthy adults with normal cholesterol levels, they would serve as their own sort of control. They did 3 separate diets for 5 weeks in a row in succession. So this whole study lasted 15 weeks. The control diet was apparently the typical Australian diet, and our Australian cohort, if you're listening to this, you can comment on whether or not this is representative of how you normally eat. They called this a high cholesterol, high saturated fat diet. They had 1 egg per week or less. It was 25% protein, 50% carbohydrates, and 35% fat. And of that fat intake, 12% was saturated fat and averaged out to be about 600 milligrams of cholesterol per day. Then they ran a 5-week diet where they had a bunch of eggs, at least 2 eggs per day. This was the high dietary cholesterol, low saturated fat group. Their macro proportions was 20% protein, 45% carbohydrates, and 35% fat again, except it was only 6% of their fat intake came from saturated fat. But again, still high in dietary cholesterol, 600 milligrams of cholesterol per day. And again, that's twice as much as the previous recommendation. And finally, they did 5 weeks of an egg-free diet, which they called the low cholesterol, high saturated fat diet. So no eggs. And they still had 25% of their daily calories from protein, 40% from carbohydrates, 35% from fat, and this is 12% saturated fat. and only 300 milligrams of dietary cholesterol per day. As far as outcomes that they tested, they did a standard lipid panel. So we've talked about that a bunch before. They did an apolipoprotein B, and they also did some fractionating of the actual lipid panel with some NMR, which we're going to completely ignore because not only would people's eyes glaze over, it doesn't really change the outcome of the study. Adherence to the diets were also based on food reports. So results-wise, people generally ate the diets that they were assigned to, which is pretty good. Again, this is based on like food reports, so some recall issues in there, but it's generally validated. The only things to note, the control group and the egg-free group generally had higher levels of saturated fat than they were supposed to take in. So instead of it being 12% of their daily calories from saturated fat, it was about 14%. Pretty close. And the egg diet had about 7% lower energy intake compared to the other two groups. And I know what people are, they lost weight. That's going to be the whole thing here. The weight loss was actually minimal in the 5-week period. They lost less than half a pound. So probably not contributory here. So as far as the results for the lipids, the changes seem to be better in the egg group compared to the control, that's a typical Australian diet, or the egg-free groups. So LDL went down by about 5 to 6 milligrams per deciliter compared to either the control or the egg-free groups. The non-HDL cholesterol components, that's everything that's not HDL as measured by a standard lipid panel, well, that was about 4 to 7 milligrams per deciliter lower for the egg group compared to the control or the egg-free groups. And the apolipoprotein B was also lower in the egg group by about 2 to 5 milligrams per deciliter on average. So all in all, if we just stopped here, we'd say, well, got to eat your eggs, man. Look, it's going to lower your LDL, your non-HDL, and your apolipoprotein B. Eggs are heart healthy. That's it. So before I go into my interpretation, how does that strike you, those types of changes?
They're pretty modest, and I think unlikely to translate into massive changes in long-term risk. Just like for, I guess, comparison with the first study we talked about, these changes are significantly smaller than the changes that we saw from like just swapping out how you brew your coffee, which was actually more notable, of like about 23 milligrams per deciliter in that study relating to different coffee brewing methods on LDL. Here it was just like 5 milligrams per deciliter, which is quite small, all things considered. It's not nothing, but it's quite small. Ultimately with this study, I'm glad, people are still doing this type of research, in a more rigorous, systematic way. But I have to point out, we have known this for like 70 years. People, unfortunately to this day in the nutrition space on social media, they love to hate on Ansel Keys, but he was the OG in the 1950s, came up with the Keys equation, which based on metabolic ward trial data, predicted almost exactly the change that we observe with respect to blood cholesterol levels when it comes to dietary cholesterol in the context of differing dietary compositions based on saturated and polyunsaturated fats. And so the short, simplified version of that story is that higher saturated fat intakes in the diet have twice the cholesterol raising effect as polyunsaturated fats tend to lower it. And so when you make changes in dietary cholesterol. So basically the surrounding dietary context around a given amount of dietary cholesterol will impact how much does it actually affect your blood lipid panel. So if somebody is consuming 300, 600, 900 milligrams of cholesterol, whatever the case is, if they're consuming that in the context of a diet that is much higher in saturated fat than polyunsaturated, we would expect to see a more significant increase in their blood cholesterol levels. Whereas if the opposite is true, if the saturated fat content of the diet is much lower compared with the polyunsaturated fat content, we tend to see little or more often no effect at all. And so I think that is kind of reflective in some ways of what we're observing here, that when saturated fat tends to be more limited, we're not seeing, any sort of horrific increases in blood cholesterol levels for sure. So the surrounding diet, as tends to be very often the case, is the king.
What do you think if people just took their eggs and filtered their eggs through a paper filter? Look, would that work?
They would taste bad, but
yeah. You'd have to have some sort, maybe a sock. Maybe a sock is the correct filter thing. Yeah, I mean, obviously these results aren't crazy, and some of that's due to obviously the very modest differences in dietary pattern between the groups, and the other thing is, well, these diets only lasted 5 weeks. It would be more interesting and certainly cost more money. Well, what if these were 20-week trials, right, or year-long trials? But
especially who's buying all those eggs these days,
Yeah, in this economy, yeah. I would predict, though, if this change is real, right? If they're not due to the analytical variation of the test, the biological variation of the test for, cholesterol, and you ran this for longer, I would predict that the changes might get a little bigger, perhaps bordering on something that you would care about. But ultimately, I'm just giving it a shoulder shrug, right? I suspect, maybe the bigger thing here is like, hey, National Academies of Science, you guys want to like maybe add a little bit of something to your recommendation, like no dietary cholesterol? That seems rather reductionist, and also like you didn't give any real context in the current guidelines. You didn't talk about the surrounding dietary pattern at all. And like, as far as practical counseling advice to your patient on a dietary pattern, what does that look like? Hey, avoid dietary cholesterol. And people are like, well, what foods have dietary cholesterol in them? Oh, like most of them? Okay, well, yeah, that seems, not very helpful. Rather, what you would say is like, look, you probably want a diet that's mostly minimally processed or unprocessed to the extent that you can do that. Next, you'd probably want to avoid foods that have added sugar in them, and here's how you'd identify that by looking at the label. Again, generally would not be processed or and would be something you'd have to cook. And then you'd also want to maybe look at your saturated fat intake. Like if it has a bunch of extra saturated fat in it, and if your maybe total daily intake is more than 10% of your total daily calories, it's probably too much. Mm-hmm. And if that's the dietary pattern you like, you're a carnivore, keto, that's your diet, that's what you love, I'd probably consider addressing dietary cholesterol specifically. And here are some common foods that I've identified through your dietary pattern that have a bunch of dietary cholesterol in them. That would all be far more helpful than as it's currently stated in the guidelines.
Yeah, I think so. And then if I had to add anything to what you said, that would be a further justification to try to crank up dietary fiber as much as the person is willing to, because that can also mitigate some of these effects.
Yeah, they discussed in the first paper on the coffee brewing method. They're like, well, what if you added oat milk to the person's coffee instead of heavy whipping cream, for example, heavy cream? Well, there's beta glucan, which is a type of fiber in the oat milk, and so perhaps that would offset the diterpene. Anyway,
I think that effect is probably minimal compared with the saturated fat effect of heavy cream. But anyway,
So as far as like some explicit recommendations for eggs, I'm not going to give you one that says don't eat eggs. And in fact, I'd have a really tough time saying to limit eggs for any other reason other than if somebody knows that they're a hyper absorber of cholesterol, for example, or if they had a dietary pattern that was otherwise high in saturated fat. It's tough to tell if someone is a hyperabsorber unless they've had pretty extensive regular testing of their cholesterol levels and they've tried stuff, meaning like they're on medications, they're trying other lifestyle stuff, exercise, change the dietary pattern, and still you can't get them to that's a smaller than predicted response. And you're like, well, maybe you're just a hyperabsorber, which does affect, about 1/3 of the population. We think it's mostly genetic. There's various transporters in the small intestine that may be pickled, which again is a medical term for like not working how we think. Just like there's some genetic variations where people don't absorb hardly any dietary cholesterol. The body just ends up figuring out ways to make more to offset that. So it's hard to tell. But that would be like a potential use case where, okay, maybe, eggs or the yolks of the egg, for example, maybe something that you'd benefit from removing. But that's not common and wouldn't be my first move off the dome.
Yeah. And if somebody still was identified in that group and really wanted to consume that kind of a diet, I mean, ezetimibe will handle that. If you wanted to take a dose of ezetimibe and mitigate, people who do tend to be of this more hyperabsorber phenotype, they tend to have much more robust responses in terms of lipid lowering to ezetimibe compared with others.
Yeah, there you go. All right, well, that is a wrap here on the Barbell Medicine Podcast, our May 2025 research review. Before you guys go anywhere, all of the links to the papers we discussed here and some of the supporting evidence in the show notes below. We really want to make sure you have access to our educational resources. Also, we did just release new second generation General Strength Conditioning 1 template. Our program library is now live. We have new articles on the website. The testosterone course with Dr. Baraki is live, and of course, you can get a free form check by going to our website, clicking the shop tab, then form check. It's free. We'll take care of the rest. And before you guys go anywhere, please leave us a 5-star rating and a review. It really helps drive traffic to our podcast so we can keep bringing you all the latest nuance in health and fitness. From everyone here at Barbell Medicine, I'm Dr. Jordan Feigenbaum. We'll catch you next week and every week right here on the Barbell Medicine Podcast.